I spent years learning random celebrity voices for fun. It ended up saving my sister's life. Everyone thought I was wasting my time with the voice impressions, and honestly, I couldn't blame them, because what kind of 28-year-old man spends 6 hours a day practicing celebrity voices in his apartment while working a dead-end job at a call center? My name is Colin, and for the past 7 years, I'd been obsessed with vocal mimicry, not just doing surface-level impressions, but actually studying the physiological mechanics of how different people produce sound, analyzing pitch patterns and resonance, and the subtle muscle movements that make each voice unique. It started as a party trick in college when I did a Morgan Freeman impression that made my roommate spit out his beer, and somehow it spiraled into this all-consuming hobby where I'd spend entire weekends watching interviews and movies, breaking down every vocal quirk and practicing until my throat was raw. My girlfriend left me over it 2 years ago, said I cared more about sounding like other people than being myself, and my parents kept hinting that maybe I should focus on my actual career instead of this weird obsession that would never pay bills or lead anywhere productive. But I couldn't stop because there was something almost meditative about the process of deconstructing a voice and rebuilding it in my own throat, like solving a complex puzzle where the pieces were muscle memory and breath control. I had a whole notebook filled with phonetic breakdowns and audio recordings of my practice sessions, tracking my progress with different celebrities like it was scientific research. By 2023, I could do maybe 30 voices convincingly enough that people couldn't tell the difference in a phone call. Everyone from actors like Tom Hanks and Samuel Jackson to politicians like Obama and Trump, even some YouTube personalities and podcast hosts whose vocal patterns I'd studied obsessively. My younger sister Tessa used to think it was cool when we were kids, would beg me to do different voices during car rides or when she needed cheering up. But as we got older, she started making the same comments as everyone else about how I needed to grow up and focus on real skills that mattered. She was studying pre-med at Stanford, brilliant and driven and everything I wasn't, and family dinners became uncomfortable when my parents would praise her accomplishments and then ask me with forced optimism if anything interesting was happening with my hobby. The last time I'd seen Tessa before everything happened was at Christmas 6 months ago, and we'd gotten into an argument about my life choices that ended with her saying something that really hurt. She'd said that I was hiding behind other people's voices because I was too scared to figure out who I actually was, that my impressions were just another way of avoiding real human connection and responsibility. I'd gotten defensive, and we hadn't spoken much after that, just occasional texts and awkward phone calls where we both pretended the fight hadn't happened. My mom kept trying to get us to make up, but I was stubborn, and Tessa was busy with school, and somehow 6 months passed without us really reconciling. Then, on a Wednesday evening in June, I got a phone call from my mom, and I could tell immediately something was catastrophically wrong from the way her voice sounded, that particular quality of panic that only comes when something terrible has happened to someone you love. She told me that Tessa had been kidnapped from the Stanford campus, taken from the parking lot outside her dorm building around 8 at night, and the police had found her car with her phone and bag inside, but no signs of struggle or obvious evidence about where she'd been taken. The next hours were a nightmare of police interviews and coordinating with my parents, who lived 3 hours away in Sacramento while I was down in San Jose. The police were treating it seriously, given the circumstances, but they kept saying the first 24 hours were critical, and they needed any information we could provide about enemies or stalkers, or anyone who might want to hurt Tessa. She didn't have enemies, though. She was universally liked, focused entirely on school and volunteer work at the campus clinic, barely even dated because she was so dedicated to her studies. The detectives asked me when I'd last spoken to her, and I had to admit it had been 3 weeks ago, just a brief text exchange about nothing important. And I felt this crushing guilt that we'd wasted 6 months being distant over a stupid argument when now she might be dying somewhere, and our last real conversation had been a fight. My parents arrived around midnight, and we spent the night in a hotel near campus, none of us sleeping, just staring at our phones and waiting for updates from the police or a ransom call that never came. The ransom call finally came 36 hours after Tessa was taken, but not to any of our phones. It came to the police tip line, and the detective in charge of the case called us immediately to come to the station. They played us the recording, and I felt my stomach drop, listening to this distorted voice demanding $200,000 in cryptocurrency, giving detailed instructions about how the transfer needed to happen, and threatening that, if we contacted law enforcement or tried to trace the call, then Tessa would die. The police said the voice was being electronically modified, which made it impossible to identify gender or age or any useful characteristics. And they were working with FBI to try to trace where the call originated, but these kidnappers seemed sophisticated enough to mask their location effectively. What struck me about the recording was how practiced it sounded, like whoever was speaking had rehearsed their lines, and there was something in the rhythm and pacing that felt familiar, in a way I couldn't immediately place. The police wanted us to prepare the ransom money while they set up tracking protocols, hoping to catch the kidnappers during the exchange. But they warned us that most kidnapping cases that go this long without contact don't end well. My parents were devastated and desperate, already talking to their bank about liquidating retirement accounts and taking loans to get the ransom money together, even though they didn't have anywhere near $200,000. I felt completely useless sitting in that police station, my stupid voice impressions hobby seeming more pointless than ever when what we needed was actual helpful skills like detective work or tactical training. But I couldn't stop replaying that ransom call in my head, something about it nagging at me, and I asked the detective if I could listen to it again. He seemed skeptical, but pulled it up on his computer and let me listen with headphones 3 times in a row while I focused entirely on the vocal patterns underneath the electronic distortion. The distortion was heavy but not perfect. There were moments where the original voice bled through slightly, and I started to pick up on specific phonetic patterns that the distortion couldn't fully mask. The way certain consonants were formed, the slight lisp on S sounds, the particular rhythm of emphasis on multi-syllable words, all of it was familiar because I'd trained myself to notice exactly these kinds of vocal fingerprints. On the 4th listen, something clicked, and I felt this jolt of recognition so strong it made me actually gasp out loud. The detective asked if I was okay, and I told him I needed to hear it one more time. Needed to be absolutely sure before I said anything, because what I was thinking seemed impossible. But the 5th listen confirmed it, and I knew with complete certainty whose voice was under that distortion, and the realization made me feel physically sick because I recognized it from hundreds of hours of study and practice. It was Russell Crowe, or more specifically, someone doing a Russell Crowe impression. Not a perfect impression, but a decent one. And I knew this because I'd spent 3 months last year perfecting my own Russell Crowe voice, had studied dozens of his interviews and movie scenes, could identify the specific vocal patterns that characterized his speaking style. The kidnapper wasn't using electronic distortion at all, or at least not primarily. They were doing a voice impression and then adding distortion on top to mask it further, probably thinking that the combination would make their voice completely unidentifiable. I tried to explain this to the detective, but he looked at me like I was insane or grief-stricken to the point of delusion. He asked how I could possibly know that someone was doing an impression under distortion, and I tried to explain my background with vocal mimicry, how I'd trained myself to identify the specific muscle patterns and phonetic choices that make up different voices. The detective was polite but dismissive, said that they were working with actual voice analysis experts at the FBI, and if there was anything useful to find, they would find it, that I should leave the investigation to professionals and focus on supporting my parents. But I couldn't let it go because I knew I was right, knew with absolute certainty that someone was using a celebrity impression to mask their identity, which meant they probably had some connection to vocal performance or acting or something related to that world. I asked if there was any way to analyze which specific Russell Crowe performances the kidnapper's impression was most similar to, thinking maybe we could narrow down their training or background. But the detective basically patted me on the shoulder and suggested I go get some rest. My parents could see I was fixated on something, and my dad asked what I was thinking, so I told them my theory about the voice impression. My mom looked heartbroken like this was just more evidence of me being unable to face reality seriously, and my dad asked gently if maybe I was looking for ways to feel useful instead of accepting that this was beyond what any of us could do. Their reaction hurt, but I understood it because from their perspective their son was obsessing over celebrity voices while their daughter was being held captive somewhere, and nothing about my theory would actually help us find Tessa or get her back safely. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was right, that my 7 years of weird, obsessive practice had finally given me a skill that actually mattered, and if I could just figure out who was doing the Russell Crowe impression, then maybe we could identify the kidnapper before the ransom exchange went wrong. I decided to take a different approach and started thinking about who in Tessa's life might have experience with voice work or acting or impressions, anyone who would have both the skill to do a decent celebrity voice and the access to grab her from campus. I went back to the hotel and spent hours going through Tessa's social media, looking at everyone she was connected to and trying to find anyone with a performance background. Most of her friends were other pre-med students or people from her volunteer work, nobody who obviously fit the profile I was looking for. But then I found something interesting in her Instagram followers. There was an account for someone named Damian Fulton who listed himself as a voice actor and impressionist, and when I checked his profile, I saw that he'd commented on several of Tessa's posts over the past year. Nothing overtly creepy, but enough engagement to suggest he was paying attention to her. His own posts showed him doing various celebrity impressions, including Russell Crowe, and while they weren't professional quality, they were decent enough to be recognizable. I felt my heart rate increase as I dug deeper into his profile and saw that he'd posted about financial troubles and a recent eviction, complaining about how voice acting wasn't paying enough to survive in the Bay Area, all potential motivations for a desperate kidnapping scheme. I immediately called the detective handling Tessa's case and told him about Damian Fulton, explaining the connection through social media and the voice acting background that matched my theory about the ransom call. The detective said they'd look into it, but his tone suggested he wasn't taking it seriously, was probably just humoring me to get me off the phone. I asked if they'd at least run a background check or see if Fulton had any connection to the Stanford campus, and the detective said yes. They'd add him to their list of people to investigate, but reminded me that they had multiple leads they were pursuing, and I shouldn't get fixated on this one theory. After hanging up, I felt frustrated and helpless, convinced that I'd identified the kidnapper but unable to make anyone take me seriously, and time was running out because the ransom exchange was scheduled for tomorrow morning. My parents were trying to finalize the money transfer while I was obsessing over this voice actor they'd never heard of, and the disconnect made me feel even more isolated and useless. But then I had an idea that was probably stupid and definitely dangerous, but I couldn't think of any other way to confirm my suspicions or help find Tessa before the exchange went wrong. If Damian Fulton was the kidnapper and he was using a Russell Crowe impression to mask his identity, then maybe I could use my own impression skills to make contact with him in a way that would reveal information. I found his phone number listed on his voice acting portfolio website and called it from my hotel room, not really having a plan, but knowing I needed to do something. He answered after 3 rings with a cautious, "Hello?" and I could immediately hear that it was the same voice from the ransom call. Even without the distortion, I recognized the underlying patterns. I decided to take a massive risk and responded using my Morgan Freeman impression, the one that had started this whole obsession 7 years ago, figuring that if he was another impressionist, he'd recognize what I was doing and maybe be thrown off guard enough to make a mistake. There was a long pause before Damian responded, and when he spoke again, I could hear confusion and wariness in his tone. He asked who I was and what I wanted, and I stayed in the Morgan Freeman voice saying that I knew what he'd done and that he needed to let the girl go before this got worse. Another pause, longer this time, and then he laughed and said that I was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid to call him like this. Asked how I'd found him and what made me think I knew anything. I told him still in Freeman's voice that I recognized his Russell Crowe impression in the ransom call, that I was also a voice actor, and I'd studied the same performances he'd clearly been practicing, and that the police were already investigating him, so his best option was to release Tessa and maybe get a lighter sentence. Damian's tone shifted to something more dangerous, and he said that if I was actually working with police, I wouldn't be calling him myself like an amateur, that I was clearly acting alone and had just made a fatal mistake. He told me that if I contacted police or anyone else about our conversation, then Tessa would die immediately, that he had nothing to lose at this point, and was happy to add another body to his problems. My heart was racing, and I abandoned the Morgan Freeman voice, speaking as myself and begging him to just tell me if Tessa was okay, if she was hurt, if there was any way to resolve this without anyone dying. Damian seemed to calm slightly when I dropped the impression and asked who I was, why I cared so much about this specific case. I told him I was Tessa's brother, that I'd been studying voices for years as a hobby and had recognized his impression in the ransom call, that I just wanted my sister back safely. There was another long pause, and then Damian said something that made my blood run cold. He said that if I was really her brother, then I should know that she talks about me sometimes, about how disappointed she is in how I turned out, how I wasted my potential on stupid party tricks instead of doing anything meaningful with my life. The fact that he knew personal details about our relationship confirmed he'd been watching Tessa closely, probably for weeks or months, learning about her family and life in preparation for the kidnapping. I tried to keep him talking, using techniques I'd seen in hostage negotiation scenes from movies, which was probably not the right approach but was all I had to work with. I asked him what he wanted beyond the money, what had driven him to this point, trying to build some kind of rapport that might make him see Tessa as a person, rather than a commodity. Damien said that nobody saw voice actors as real performers, that we were always dismissed as doing party tricks or wasting time on useless skills, and he'd spent 10 years trying to make a career out of something he loved, only to end up broke and desperate. He said that people like Tessa got to pursue their dreams with family support and financial stability, while people like him and me had to watch from the sidelines. And the irony wasn't lost on him that her brother was calling him using the same skills that society deemed worthless. I recognized something in his words, a bitterness and frustration that mirrored my own feelings about how people viewed my impression hobby. And I realized that Damien saw himself as some kind of kindred spirit to me, another voice actor dismissed and undervalued by a world that didn't understand what we did. This connection gave me an idea, and I started speaking to him voice actor to voice actor, acknowledging that yes, the skill was dismissed and undervalued, that I'd lost relationships and opportunities because people thought it was childish or pointless. But I also told him that this wasn't the way to prove our worth, that kidnapping someone and potentially killing them would only confirm everyone's worst assumptions about us being unstable people who couldn't function in the real world. Damien listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked me to do more impressions, said he wanted to hear what I could actually do, whether I was as good as I claimed to be. So I did, cycling through different celebrity voices while sitting in that hotel room at 2 a.m, performing for the man who was holding my sister captive and might kill her if I said the wrong thing. I did Tom Hanks and Christopher Walken and Michael Caine, did my Obama impression and my Trump impression back to back, did some YouTube personalities and podcast hosts whose voices most people wouldn't recognize, but another vocal mimic might. After each impression, Damien would give feedback, critique my technique, or point out where my pitch was slightly off, and I realized we were having the kind of conversation I'd always wanted to have with another impressionist, someone who understood the craft at the level I'd been practicing it. But underlying the professional discussion was this horrible awareness that Tessa was somewhere scared and possibly hurt, that every minute I spent bonding with her kidnapper was another minute she was in danger, and I needed to figure out how to turn this rapport into actual actionable information. I took a chance and asked Damien if he'd let me hear Tessa's voice, just to confirm she was alive and okay, promising that I wouldn't try to trace the call or bring in police if he'd just give me that reassurance. He was silent for a long time, and I thought he was going to refuse or hang up or worse, but then he said, okay, said he'd put me on speaker and let me talk to her for 30 seconds, but if I tried anything stupid, they were both dead. There was a rustling sound, and then I heard Tessa's voice, weak and scared, but definitely her, saying my name as a question, like she couldn't believe I was actually on the phone. I told her I was working on getting her out, that she needed to hold on just a little longer, and I tried to keep my voice steady, even though I was falling apart inside. She started to say something else, but Damien cut her off and came back on the line, saying that was enough, that I'd confirmed she was alive, and now I needed to keep my end of the deal and stay quiet until after the ransom exchange tomorrow morning. But I'd gotten what I needed from that 30-second call because I'd heard something in the background that might tell me where Tessa was being held. Behind her voice, there'd been a very specific sound, a rhythmic mechanical noise that I recognized from my own apartment building, the particular pattern of an industrial HVAC system cycling on, and it had a distinctive high-pitched whine that was characteristic of older units from a specific manufacturer. I knew this because I'd spent countless hours in my apartment practicing voices, and I'd become intimately familiar with every background noise in my environment, including the exact sound signature of the HVAC system. The unit I'd heard behind Tessa's voice had the same pattern, but slightly different pitch, suggesting it was the same model but in a different location. And if I could figure out where else these specific units were installed in the Bay Area, I might be able to narrow down where she was being held. I told Damien I'd keep quiet like he asked, but I needed one more thing. Needed him to help me with a Russell Crowe impression I'd been struggling with, specifically the accent work from Master and Commander. It was a risk asking him to do his signature impression without the distortion, but I was banking on his ego as a voice actor, his desire to demonstrate his skill and prove that he was better than me at this one thing. Damien hesitated, and then said, fine, said he'd give me some coaching, but I'd better not be recording this or trying anything clever. He launched into his Russell Crowe impression, and I listened carefully. not just to the voice itself, but to the acoustic environment around him, the way his voice reflected off surfaces, and the presence or absence of ambient noise that would tell me about the space he was in. The acoustics suggested a small room with hard surfaces, probably concrete or tile, and there was that same HVAC noise I'd heard when Tessa spoke, plus something else, a distant rhythmic sound that might have been industrial equipment or machinery. After Damien finished his coaching and we ended the call, I spent the next 3 hours researching industrial HVAC systems and trying to map locations in the Bay Area where these specific units were commonly installed. The manufacturer was a company called Thermotron that had primarily sold to commercial and industrial facilities in the 1980s and 90s, and their units were known for that particular high-pitched whine I'd recognized. I cross-referenced this with areas accessible from Stanford campus where Damien could have taken Tessa, looking for abandoned or low-traffic industrial buildings that might have these older HVAC systems still running. The search was frustratingly broad at first, but then I remembered the distant machinery sound I'd heard and started focusing on areas near active industrial operations, places where you'd hear equipment running in the background, but the building itself might be abandoned or underused. I found 3 possible locations that fit all my criteria: an old bottling plant in Palo Alto that had been partially shut down, a warehouse complex in Menlo Park that was mostly vacant, and a defunct manufacturing facility in Mountain View that was slated for demolition but hadn't been torn down yet. I called the detective handling Tessa's case and told him about the phone call with Damien and the locations I'd identified, expecting him to dismiss me again, but he actually listened this time. He said that talking to the kidnapper directly had been incredibly dangerous and stupid, but since I'd already done it, the information about the HVAC sound might be useful, and they'd send teams to check all 3 locations immediately. I asked if I could come along, and he said absolutely not, that I'd done enough damage already by potentially spooking the kidnapper, and I needed to stay away from the active operation. So I went back to my hotel room where my parents were finally sleeping from exhaustion, and I waited, checking my phone compulsively and replaying my conversation with Damien, trying to figure out if I'd actually helped or just made everything worse. The call came at 6 in the morning from the detective saying they'd found Tessa at the Mountain View location. She was alive and being taken to the hospital, but appeared to be mostly unharmed. Damien had tried to run when SWAT breached the building, but they'd apprehended him without shots fired, and he was in custody facing multiple felony charges, including kidnapping, extortion, and unlawful imprisonment. The detective said that my information about the HVAC sound had been crucial in identifying the right location, and that if I hadn't called with that lead, they might not have found Tessa until after the ransom exchange, when it could have been too late. He also said I was reckless and lucky, and should never attempt anything like that again, but there was a tone of grudging respect in his voice that suggested he understood why I'd done it. My parents woke up when they heard me on the phone, and my mom started crying in relief when I told them Tessa had been found, and we all rushed to the hospital where she was being examined and treated for dehydration and minor injuries. Tessa was in surprisingly good condition considering the circumstances. Damien had kept her in that abandoned building with minimal food and water, but hadn't physically hurt her beyond the initial grabbing during the kidnapping. When I finally got to see her in the hospital room, she looked small and exhausted, but her eyes lit up when I walked in, and she said my name in a way that made me start crying immediately. I apologized for the fight we'd had at Christmas, told her she'd been right about me hiding behind impressions instead of dealing with real life, but she interrupted me and said that actually, I'd been wrong about that. The detective had told her how I'd identified the kidnapper through his voice, and how my years of obsessive practice with impressions had given me the specific knowledge needed to find her, and she said that maybe the skill wasn't useless after all, that it had literally saved her life when nothing else could have. We both cried and hugged, and I felt this enormous weight lift off my shoulders, the guilt about our fight finally released, along with the terror of potentially losing her. The story made national news over the next week, the unusual angle of someone using voice impression skills to identify a kidnapper and rescue their sister, and I ended up doing several interviews about the experience. Most of the coverage focused on the feel-good redemption narrative of the dismissed hobby turning out to be valuable, but I tried to be honest about how much luck had been involved, and how easily everything could have gone wrong. Damien pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a 25-year sentence without possibility of parole for 15 years, and the court documents revealed he'd been planning the kidnapping for months after becoming obsessed with Tessa through her social media presence. He'd seen her posts about her pre-med studies and her affluent family background, and had convinced himself that she represented everything he'd been denied, and taking her had been both about the ransom money and about punishing someone who seemed to have an easy path while he struggled. Reading his statements made me feel a complicated mix of anger and pity, understanding his frustration with being dismissed, while being horrified by how he'd channeled that frustration into harming an innocent person. The experience changed my relationship with voice impressions in ways I'm still processing months later. I still practice, and I still enjoy the craft, but now there's this weight of knowing that the skill I'd developed for fun had been crucial in a life-or-death situation and could theoretically be important again someday. Several people have asked me if I plan to pursue voice acting professionally now that I have this compelling story to tell, but honestly, I'm not sure that's what I want. The impressions were always about personal satisfaction, and the joy of mastering something difficult and turning them into a career might ruin that purity of motivation. What I do know is that I'll never again feel defensive or ashamed when people dismiss the hobby as childish or pointless, because I have concrete proof that seemingly useless skills can matter in ways you never expect. Tessa and I talk regularly now, much more than we did before the kidnapping, and she's back at Stanford finishing her degree with additional security measures in place. She jokes sometimes that I should add hostage negotiator to my resume under special skills, and while she's kidding, I think there's a kernel of truth there about how the things we're passionate about shape us in unpredictable ways. My parents have also completely changed their tune about my impression hobby, going from gentle mockery to telling everyone they meet about how their sons' voices saved their daughter's life. It's a bit embarrassing, honestly, the way they brag about it at family gatherings and dinner parties, but I understand that they're processing their own trauma from almost losing Tessa, and this is their way of making meaning from something terrible. The attention has been overwhelming at times. People I barely know reaching out to tell me their stories about undervalued skills that turned out to matter, or to ask me to teach them voice impressions like it's a superpower anyone can learn with enough practice. I try to explain that it took me 7 years of daily practice to get to a level where I could identify someone else's impression under electronic distortion, that there's no shortcut to developing that kind of ear for vocal patterns, but people seem to want to believe in quick fixes and instant expertise rather than acknowledging the slow accumulation of skill over time. The most unexpected outcome has been other voice actors and impressionists reaching out to share their own experiences of being dismissed or undervalued, creating this community I didn't know existed of people who take the craft seriously. I've started attending workshops and connecting with professional voice actors who've been doing this work for decades, learning techniques and approaches that I'd never developed on my own through isolated practice. These connections have enriched my understanding of what voice work can be beyond just party trick impressions, opening up possibilities for audiobook narration and character voices and other applications I'd never considered. It's ironic that Damien was right about voice actors being undervalued and dismissed, but his response to that dismissal was to hurt someone, while mine has led to finding a community of people who share the passion and understand the dedication required to master the craft. I think about that parallel sometimes, how two people with similar skills and frustrations can respond in such different ways, and I'm grateful that my obsession channeled into something harmless rather than destructive. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.